Okay, the countdown went to 0 and we are back for the second part of our program. We have two great panels, and so I'm sure you're going to want to stay to the very end. Our first panel is on water and is moderated by Eric Hoek. Eric is a professor at UCLA's Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering, Institute of the Environment and Sustainability, and the California Nanosystems Institute. He is also faculty director of the UCLA Sustainable LA Grand Challenge, a campus-wide initiative to transform Los Angeles into the first sustainable megacity by 2050. Eric has deep experience both as an entrepreneur and in his research has published more than 100 articles on environmental science, on water, and in engineering. And with that brief introduction, you have a better and fuller introduction in the packet. Let me turn it over to Eric and the panel.
Thank you, Jerry. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here today. This panel, we're talking about water. I'm going to start with the bad news. Our local water supply currently significantly lacks drought resilience. It's increasingly impaired, meaning polluted, while our traditional freshwater supplies are decreasing. And this is happening due to a perfect storm of different factors. One is climate change, which leads to earlier snow melt, more severe droughts, and decreases available surface and groundwater supplies. Two is we have many legacy contaminated aquifers and also some newly emerging contaminants, which impair our ability to produce water from our available local groundwater. And three, we have some new regulations like SGMA, which could significantly decrease groundwater withdrawals in many locations. We also have a growing population to support with finite and declining traditional freshwater resources. So as a result, the cost of drinking water and sanitation services have increased pretty significantly over the past few decades. Now the good news. So in recent years, there have been some major commitments across the LA region to increase our drought resilience, to localize our water supply up to 70 to 80% by 2035 through sustained conservation efforts, capture and harvesting of stormwater through major investments in green infrastructure via Measure W, which was passed a few years back, and through 100% recycling of our municipal wastewater for stream augmentation, as in the LA River, landscape irrigation throughout LA, and both indirect and direct potable reuse. Also, we have desalinations already happening in San Diego and Santa Barbara, maybe Monterey and Orange County sometime soon. But what about in LA? And another market-based approach has taken off in the past few years. Water futures have now joined gold, oil, and other commodities being traded on Wall Street, and highlighting worries that this life-sustaining natural resource may become scarce across more of the world. And principally, these futures help major water users like agribusinesses, energy utilities, water purveyors to manage risk and better align supply and demand. Still, many questions remain about how to finance these multi-billion-dollar infrastructure investments, how to create this new infrastructure in a just and equitable way, meaning where to locate the plants and pipelines, and will there be opportunities for green job creation? And also how to increase our local freshwater resources without dramatically increasing public health risk of exposure to these legacy and emerging contaminants, in addition to the higher energy demand and carbon footprint of deploying the advanced technologies needed to produce clean fresh water from non-traditional sources. So we have an all-star panel of experts here today to frame these issues in greater detail, discuss and debate potential solutions, as well as potential trade-offs and impediments to moving forward. We have Professor Kathy Jacobs, who is the director of the Center for Climate Adaptation Science and Solutions at the University of Arizona. We have Dr. Ellen Hanak, who is Vice President and Director of the Water Policy Center and Senior Fellow at the Public Policy Institute of California, and David Osias, who's a partner in the Environmental and Natural Resources Practice Group at the law firm of Allen Matkins. Now I'm going to ask our esteemed panelists to each take a few minutes to introduce themselves, to highlight one of the most critical water-related challenges we face here in Southern California now or in the future. Starting with Kathy, please give us a little background info and briefly tell us what water issue is keeping you up at night.
Well, thank you very much, Eric, and thanks to all of you for letting me join you. I'm an imposter from the eastern side of the Colorado River. I'm located in Tucson, Arizona. My background in water dates back to 1981. I worked for the Arizona Department of Water Resources for almost 25 years before joining the University of Arizona as a faculty member. I've been engaged in water management and climate and ran the US National Climate Assessment in the Obama White House for 4 years. My current challenge really focuses on how do we use scientific information for climate adaptation, and how can we accelerate the pace of adaptation to try to manage the risks that are associated with climate change. I'll talk about a couple of issues that I'm concerned about, but most of them relate to this issue of whether or not we're keeping up with the rate of increase in risk. So the first issue is the drivers of change that we're dealing with right now are not just climate change, but we are seeing changes in the supply side affected by some change in precipitation, a lot of change in temperature, but even changes in land use affect water supply. And so that needs to be taken into account. There's also the demand side. So as precipitation reduces or temperature increases, the demand for water changes as well. And of course, where we have changes in population, that matters as well. But the water use patterns have a big impact on the demand. But even more substantial than that, I think in California, are changing values, including things like protecting endangered species, the importance of recreation, quality of life issues, and so forth. And all of those are connected to water management policies. So there's a lot of complexity in the water management arena and a lot of driving factors that are affecting both quality and quantity of water. One of the things that I think most people have missed in trying to understand what the impacts of climate change on water supply are is the fact that it's not just how much it rains. In fact, we don't know all that much about how precipitation patterns are going to change in the future, but we are absolutely certain that the temperatures are going to increase. And the relationship between temperature and water supply is poorly understood, but very dramatic. So every time you get an increase in temperature of 1 degree, there's a substantial reduction in the runoff in rivers, and you lose an incredible amount of water into the atmosphere, both through use of water by plants and through evaporation. So the temperature factor in the climate change equation is known, and it is increasing, and there's nothing we can do about it in the short term. In the longer term, there's a lot we can do about it, and that has to do with, of course, managing emissions. But the driving force on the water supply is actually coming from heat, and we're seeing, for example, flows in the Colorado River dramatically declining already, with an anticipated increase in declines going forward. So it's a pretty dramatic challenge. I've been working on adaptation issues in the Colorado River, both thinking about the renegotiation of the guidelines for managing the river and thinking about how a broader set of societal and environmental objectives could be incorporated into future management. And also, how can we bring to the table folks who have historically not been invited? And that includes tribes and non-governmental organizations and people from Mexico. But this is a river that serves 40 million people and over 7 states plus Mexico. And we need to have a more equitable conversation about how that moves forward. I've also been working with water utilities and how to manage the risks to their business functions. And that's a conversation that I would think be of interest to many other businesses as well, because most people don't think about how climate change is going to affect, for example, their employees who work outdoors or their supply chain or a range of other issues that are really critical to their functions. And then finally, back to the accelerating adaptation idea, I've been really concerned about how to get private citizens and others engaged more effectively in both observing what's changing and doing something about it. I've been working on a network called the Science for Climate Action Network, which is national, but will have a number of nodes in all of the states. So I'll stop there and turn it back over to Eric. Thank you.
That was great, Kathy. Thank you so much. Ellen, let's move over to you. Do the same little bit of background and let us know what's keeping you up at night.
Thank you, and nice to be with all of you today. Appreciate the invitation. So I have been working on California water for about 20 years now. That's when I moved to the state in 2001. Before that, I spent the earlier part of my career working on internationally on agricultural development issues. And when I got to California, I joined my institute, the Public Policy Institute of California, which was very young at the time, and kind of figuring out where to do work. And they said, well, California agriculture is a big deal, so maybe that's a good place to look. That's probably why they hired me. But then the board had a discussion about other issues between when they hired me and when I got there. And one of those was, gee, maybe we should do some work on water. So they suggested I should check it out. And I went around and met with a lot of experts. And I realized that there was an incredible alignment between my background in agriculture and the idea of water, because water is just a huge resource for agriculture in California and in the West. So when we think about our economies out here in the West, obviously, the urban and suburban economies are the bigger part of it. That's where people mostly live, and that's where a lot of economic activity is located. But our climates are such that if you can add water during the growing season to the sunshine that we have out here in the West, you can grow some really high value crops. So about 80% of the water used by people in California is used within agriculture, with about 20% used by cities and suburbs and non-farm businesses. So that's kind of how I got into water. And at PPIC, we work with a lot of researchers from around the state and outside of California, actually, together with interfacing with a lot of the stakeholders at the state level, at the local level, in the nonprofit sector, at the federal level, to kind of bring the science to bear on big challenging issues of the day. So covers a wide range of water issues, including in the urban sector, which I'll get to in a minute. I just, to answer it honestly, what keeps me up at night, I will say that I'm fundamentally an optimist. I think it's hard to work on water issues for a long time without, unless you really like unless you really relish wallowing in doom, you kind of have to be optimistic in this space. And I'm sure that's true for David and Kathy and you, Eric, as well. You got to think that there are ways that we can get better. And I think that, so I don't usually lie awake worrying about water issues. It might be about a deadline or something like that. But I will say that, in relation to kind of water management issues and water in California and the changing climate, I think the issues around wildfire risk are, they can keep you up at night, because you may be worried that you're going to get a call that you got to get out of your house, which is something that has happened to neighbors up the hill from me. But it kind of ties back into the earlier session on sea level rise and housing, and this is just going to be a bigger and bigger issue for many parts of California as our climate gets hotter and as evaporation increases, and we've got this background situation of headwater forests that need better management. It's a vital part of our, it's connected to the water system as a supply and quality issue in fundamental ways, because that's where a lot of our water originates. But it's also just, you know, the kind of near term, it's probably the real near term biggest impact of the changing climate that we're seeing in California right now. So that's what keeps me up at night, especially in some seasons. And I'm really hoping that it is going to rain this weekend, because I don't feel like we're out of the woods yet on our fire season until we get some really good rains. I think, you know, when I look at Southern California specifically, I'm actually pretty optimistic, Eric, in relation to the challenges that the region faces, because it's a huge, you know, 22 million people live in the 6 counties of Southern California. A lot, you know, hundreds of water agencies, including some really big ones, the Metropolitan Water District in particular, which, you know, kind of is a backup or wholesale supplier for at least part of the water for most of those residents. And there's just a tradition now of really sophisticated planning and of thinking about water supply really as a portfolio with an aim to manage risk. And it's a moving target. It's not, you're never done. So, you know, the Met region is in the midst of, I think probably now maybe it's the 6th integrated resources plan process. And this time they're really taking another full look at the climate change implications for what they need to do. But what you see has happened over the last couple decades is tremendous investments in building a more robust supply portfolio as well as long-term demand management. So the region was using, not only on a per capita basis, but on a total basis, much more water in 2000 than it is today. And that in and of itself is a really good, both an adaptation mechanism for managing the changing climate, but also it helps mitigate climate change because it just means that much less energy. So that's I'll stop there for now, and, you know, if we have time, I'll elaborate later.
That was great. And you mentioned 80% of the water consumed in California goes to agriculture. So there's a direct connection to our food supply with the availability of, you know, fresh water. Also, a factoid, somewhere close to 20% of all the electricity that's used in the state of California is for transporting or treating water. So there's a direct tie also to energy. We talk about the food, energy, water nexus sometimes. And David, why don't you go ahead and give us a little bit of background about yourself, and then same deal. What are the things that are keeping you up at night with respect to water?
Thanks, Eric, and thank you to everyone who's attending by Zoom. My sympathies to all of us for this format. I'm a native Californian, Berkeley Law graduate in 1979, so I may be one of the older people here. And I've been practicing water law for 41 years. Both transactional and litigation, and by way of a synopsis of 41 years, our law firm is a very large real estate centric civil law firm, which is why we have the connection with the forecast and the real estate survey. And so a lot of my work has historically been for real estate development, both residential, hospitality, golf course, industrial, and power plant siting in the old days when power plants used water for cooling, now no longer allowed in California. Perhaps my most prominent and notorious representation was for about 15 years representing the Imperial Irrigation District in protecting its water rights from challenges by Metropolitan, Coachella, the Bureau of Reclamation, and others, and ultimately negotiating what's called the Quantification Settlement Agreement, which took effect in 2003, and includes the conserved water transfer that some describe as voluntary, with San Diego County Water Authority and others. You know, a fairly large deal that involved almost 9 years of litigation following 5 years of negotiation and documentation. So I'm currently counsel for one of the counsels for Cal American, a investor-owned utility seeking to put a desalination plant on the Monterey Peninsula. I do water rights work for the Nature Conservancy, who's trying to create a water supply trust for habitat purposes. I've taught water law at the University of San Diego as an adjunct professor, and I'm currently a lecturer at the University of California, San Diego, in their Urban Studies and Planning Department on California water law and policy. And I can tell you what keeps me up, which is the opposite of the cliche that you should fear what you don't know. I actually fear what I do know, which is the pace of change and creativity in California water law is not up to the challenge that we face in the problems of water supply reliability and sharing. I should make a lawyerly comment. The opinions I'm about to express are entirely my own, not my law firm's, and certainly not on any of my clients. But to understand my fear, let me give you a couple minutes of history of California water law. As you know and heard, water is essential, both to life and business and the environment. It's scarce, at least at certain times. Sometimes it's flood, but oftentimes in California's history, it's been scarce in places or times, and it's heavy and expensive to both divert, store, and move. And so a framework was needed to allow reliability and dependability for water supplies when and where needed, and when geographic isolation and guns proved insufficient, water law filled the void, allowing projects to be built and capital to be invested because there'd be a long-term stability. So one of the great attributes of California water law is slow change because it furthers that stability. And one of the things I fear is that slow change will prevent solutions. So maybe just a couple of examples, and you mentioned one in your intro, Eric. When California became a state in 1850, it started with two sets of water rights laws that were mutually in effect, but incompatible and inconsistent. And from that, and then also started with groundwater as a third independent source. Science has proved not so independent now, but the law is trailing. So it had its own set of laws and regulations. It took 175 years, whatever, until 2014 for groundwater to be regulated at the state level at all. That's not too encouraging. And then that regulation is to require, first of all, is in response to substantial land subsidence. I mean, we're talking 10s, 20s, 30 feet in the Central Valley, seawater intrusion along the coast, and obviously supply scarcity. And so finally, after all those years, a statewide regulatory regime is adopted, which has as a defining characteristic that it's not intended to change any water law or water rights, but requires basin-wide plans to bring overdrafted basins into sustainable yields within 20 years of the approved plan. So by about 2040. Now, that's relatively slow. And I know as a member of the group that can do it, that with litigation, we could easily miss 2040. there are a couple reasons that water law and water rights are resistant to change. And one of them is the complexity. Second is the ability to litigate everything. But third is something that can't be changed, which is water rights in California were recognized as private property rights. So although no one can own water, that's a public asset, a public resource, the right to use water, which is what everyone relies upon with a water right, is a property right, which can be regulated, but not taken without compensation. And so that's put a damper on a lot of things. So I worry that that rather being the grease of commerce, which is what lawyers and laws are typically in commercial transactions, we're the sand in the gears when it comes to water.
I love the analogy. And you know, thank you for that. The history and the regulatory issues and the slowness to change, I agree with you, are all very likely going to be greater impediments to making forward progress than technology or other issues. I have a list of questions that I was going to ask, but I see in the chat we already have one question. And so I thought maybe I would just jump into that. And it's a question about desalination. So the question is, what is the probability and future of desalination as one of our major California water resources? And I want to first turn to Ellen to answer that, but then go around. And I want to add a little bit of additional issues to consider. Frame it in the Los Angeles context, where we have chosen to make major investments in stormwater capture and harvesting for groundwater replenishment, and in water recycling. And desalination isn't even really part of the roadmap for LA. So maybe comment more generally, and then why maybe desal isn't part of the roadmap right now in Los Angeles. Ellen?
Sure. So, and thanks for that question, Jorge. You know, there's been a hope that desal, you can go back to writings from like President Johnson, you know, in the early 60s or mid 60s, talking about the promise of desal. And, you know, it's always been that thing that just kind of seems really obvious. Like, okay, look, there's all this, you know, there's very little fresh water compared to the amount of ocean water. It's just right there for coastal communities. Why don't we just, you know, if we can send people to the moon, we can, you know, turn that salt water into fresh water. And, you know, there are countries, especially some island economies, dry island economies, that where it's a really important source. Actually, it's a hugely important asset in the Israeli context, and it's kind of, by making water available in a place that's really dry and where people fight over water, it's kind of viewed as something that can really help lessen broader conflicts in that part of the world. They're also able to do it more cheaply than we are in California for a variety of reasons. Here, it is an expensive source relative to other sources that we have. And that's partly because California, you know, we often think of it as a dry place. You know, Kathy is living in a really dry place. There are parts of California that are pretty dry, but the state as a whole is not that dry. And we move a lot of water from the wet places to the drier places. So, you know, even though LA is a pretty dry place, a lot of the water comes from other places. And so if you look at, you know, the cost of ocean desal now, it's let's say, you know, in the $2,000 to $3,000 per acre foot range. So then acre foot is like 326,000 gallons. So, you know, that's how we think of units of water, a foot high on an acre. most other sources are still quite a bit cheaper. Places that will find it valuable, that it makes sense as part of their portfolio to make that expensive investment are places that are, you know, like San Diego at the end of the pipe. And they just worry about not having a diversified set of supplies. They want that as part of their portfolio. Places like Santa Barbara, which is not well connected to the rest of the state and to that water infrastructure, they are very drought prone. They've, you know, decided to go back into desal again. They did it a little bit earlier. You know, you're going to see some cases like that, but there are a lot of kind of things that have to, you know, back to David's point about his profession and their role in it. You know, to some extent, a lot of lawsuits are involved in desal because there are conflicts over whether it's a good idea to do that on our coastlines, as well as the cost. So beyond, even if people are willing to pay for it. I think, you know, where we're seeing more traction right now is, for one, brackish desal, which is, you know, cleaning up groundwater basins. That is cheaper because there's just not as much stuff to get out of the water. And so just the operational costs are quite a bit lower. And then, you know, part of the technology for recycled wastewater is really similar to desal. You know, you got to get the salts out of it. Once you clean it to the point where it could be discharged into rivers as treated wastewater, you still got to do some stuff to it. So it's similar technology, not quite as expensive. Same with some of the stormwater that we're doing. So there's a lot of work, and I think, Eric, you're an expert on this kind of some of these membrane technologies and things, you know, sort of the technology solutions can help us a lot with a lot of our water challenges, including, you know, things like just cleaning up, getting other kinds of contaminants out of our groundwater. So we're going to need to be using these modern technological innovations and keep pushing the envelope on it. But you broaden your view, I guess I would say, to think about diversifying in a broader way than just desal with modern technologies.
But before I go to Catherine and David, I just want to give a plug for UCLA, and the technology that you're referring to for desalination, whether it's seawater, brackish groundwater, or the way that we recycle wastewater here in Southern California, it all relies on reverse osmosis membrane technology. And the first commercially viable reverse osmosis membrane technology was invented and patented by UCLA in 1960. So based on research that was done in the late 40s and through the 1950s. So UCLA has a long history of innovation and in water and obviously in many other areas, but it's the birthplace of the internet, but it's also the birthplace of membrane-based desalination. So just again on that, you know, sort of balance of water recycling, stormwater, desalination, Kathy, give us your thoughts.
I agree with Ellen. It's great as a part of a portfolio, but as sort of the basis of a long-term water supply, at least at this point, the energy cost is huge. And at least for those of us who don't live by the ocean, the other issue is the disposal of the brine stream. So when you remove all those salts from the water, you have to put it somewhere. And, you know, in Arizona, that means essentially evaporation ponds or deep well injection. In California, it means sending it out into the ocean and hoping it doesn't kill anything. But there are a lot of concerns about environmental impacts associated with it. There also have been a lot of conversations about importing water into Arizona through exchanges with California and Mexico, using desal as an important technique. But we also have a mothballed desalination plant that was built in the 1990s to desalinate the Colorado River water, and it has not been cost effective to do that. So there's a whole array of historical activities related to this, and I'm sure the conversations aren't over because people are much more interested in expanding the supply than reducing demand further. But I'm sure that these conversations will continue.
Thank you. And David.
So let me give some examples and some maybe layman's approach to the very effective technology that works. So one example, as I mentioned in my intro, I'm currently one of many lawyers trying to assist in litigation challenges to the proposed plant in Monterey. I think at last count, 15 different lawsuits. And maybe 7 of them are still pending, plus a 2-year PUC litigated approval, then challenges in the administrative hearing before the Coastal Commission. So to get from concept to water on a desal plant is really slow. The transaction costs are hugely expensive. Before you get to the why is desal expensive to begin with. So you'll note that with the exception of the desal plant Catherine mentioned in Yuma, which I think has run maybe less than 2 weeks total in its 25-year history, private enterprise has tried to step in. So the San Diego plant was developed and the transaction costs called litigation and everything else by Poseidon, which is an investor-owned enterprise that hopes to make a profit. CalAm is an investor-owned utility, although its rates are set and governed by the PUC. Obviously, it has a long-term goal of returning value to shareholders. Government is not doing desal plants. They end up taking them over or committing to buy the output, but not in their bailiwick for obvious political reasons and others to be developed at the front line. So why is it, besides all the stuff that the lawyers are doing, why is it so expensive? So you start with some basic concepts. As Kathy mentioned, highly energy intensive. So there was this notion, site them next to fossil fuel plants, use the heat, get low expensive energy, right? So inconsistent with the new perspective of shutting down fossil fuel plants, okay? Not a lot of heat benefit from siting next to a solar array. So you have expensive energy costs. 2, and this is obvious, but people don't recognize it. Usually the ocean is the lowest spot in anyone's service territory. And every water system that can tries to use gravity to move water, okay? Because water is expensive and heavy. So you put your new source at the lowest spot in your territory, and you're pumping uphill for the rest of your career. So that's energy also, and perhaps new pipes going the other direction, I don't know. And then 3rd, they're really expensive to turn off. The OM&R for a shuttered desal plant is not cheap. So it's not like a spot transaction to help you out in an occasional drought, okay? So the very expensive water has to be sold, and that means you have to have buyers who are willing to value resiliency, redundancy, et cetera, over marginal cost of other sources. And I didn't mention, and it's appropriately so, one of the reasons it's expensive also is it's not environmentally benign per se. Besides brine, you have entrapment. So dead zones around historic plants have happened, and you can fix that by making the plant even more expensive. So that's not very optimistic, Kathy and Ellen, sorry.
Well, I think you know these are really good points, and the question really was around where does desal kind of fit in the portfolio, and why is it not really on the roadmap today for LA? And I think everything that you all just said are the reasons. It's expensive, it's energy intense, it's at the bottom of the hill, so to speak, right? We have a similar problem with water recycling in LA if we do it the traditional way, which is to build a large water recycling plant next to the large centralized wastewater treatment plant like Hyperion or the Joint Authority in Carson. which are literally downhill from the rest of LA by design, so that the sewage will flow by gravity into these plants. And if we're going to treat the water down at the bottom of the hill, whether it's seawater or recycled wastewater, you still have to pump it back up. And so that's an issue which for LA specifically is not likely to go away given our commitments to recycling our wastewater. But I want to take a little bit more of a market perspective. And there's a question from the audience. With the advent of water markets, what protections are there for economic disadvantaged communities, small farms versus large corporate entities? Does making water a commodity threaten the equitable distribution of water? And this was a follow-on to one of your comments. And also thinking about, with other commodity resources, you know, scarcity and resource allocation problems are typically addressed through market mechanisms, pricing. Is that relevant for water supply? Kathy, let's start with you.
Well, this is a conversation that I've been part of, I think, for close to 40 years now, because there has always been a concern about the degree to which water markets could be or couldn't be a solution, and how that would affect the environment, which of course doesn't actually have a wallet, or poor people, etc. And I think the answer to the question is incredibly complicated. And the reason is, just as an example, there are 5,000 water utilities in the state of California. And many of them are governed by different kinds of organizations. Some of them are municipal, some of them are private. And because of what David said before, that people don't actually own water, they own the right to use the water. There are a lot of complexities associated with market solutions. So in Arizona, I was asked, I can't even tell you how many times, why don't you just raise the price of water if you want to cause people to conserve it? And of course, there is a direct relationship when you do that. But the answer is we can't. Because of the regulatory environment that we exist in, the only way to actually affect water is in a private utility is to take it through the utility commission, whose job it is to keep the price down. So that's in the sort of background. The foreground is these water market concepts where, in theory, you would sell to the highest bidder, but in reality, we don't have a water market that really penetrates very many of these considerations. We do have cases where farmers in particular have been paid to reduce the amount of water they're using on their farms. And that kind of conservation sort of leads to, it's actually a marketing tool, because you're paying people to reduce their water use and then getting access to the water. And you've heard about that as well. So there's a lot of different kinds of water marketing, a lot of different implications, but I don't think the direct impact is that small holder utilities are going to be priced out of the market.
David, I'm sure you have some thoughts on this subject.
Let me turn my mic on. Yeah, I do. So I'll try to be succinct, because Ellen has a lot of thoughts on this, I know too. So let me start with the consequence of the question. In the era of no markets or minimal markets, the environment and environmental justice concerns are rampant. So I mean, a cynic would say, how could we be worse? But I don't want to be a cynic. So I think the concern of allocation of scarce supplies to either the highest bidder or some grading system to move water to those who produce the most economic output, A, is doomed. That's not going to happen. And B, would have unintended or not, but bad consequences for everyone who needs water and can't afford it. But I want to go back to another point, and I'm loath to do that as the lawyer in front of so many economists. But my very fundamental concept of a market is a sufficient number of willing buyers and sellers that market responses like price adjustments and reallocation of scarce goods will move. And monopolies are generally bad for markets. If I have the word right, monopsonies, which is a monopoly buyer versus a monopoly seller, are bad for markets. Excessive regulation are bad for markets. Unpredictable transaction delays are bad for markets. And so as someone who lives in the California water community, I don't know that it could meet the definition of a market, period. You take Metropolitan Water District or the State Water Project on the buying side, and I'm very interested in this commodities market, but I don't know who their sample transactions are to give reality to what they're pricing, but I'm going to look into it. but I have my doubts. And then, of course, voluntary transactions or semi-voluntary transactions where water moves and rewards go to the transferor are a key part of California's recent history and its future. But the circle of those benefited by those transactions probably needs to be expanded because there are uncompensated losses, whether it's labor inputs or other local rural community dependence on farming activity versus just farm revenue, et cetera. So let me stop there and
Jerry, I know we're running short on time. Thank you, David. Can I give Ellen the last word?
Of course.
Okay, I'll be really fast and just say that the notion, and this question is from Mike Machado, who is a former senator, state senator, a great voice on water issues. So hi, Mike, and thanks for that question. Equity in water is a really complicated thing. And, you know, you can, I don't think there's one easy solution to it, but just a little fact for you to keep in mind. I mentioned that Southern California urban and suburban water use has come way down since over the last 2 decades. That is in part a response to the fact that a number of the supply sources have also come down in order, in part, to do better things with the environment in the source regions. Like that includes LA's water source in the Owens Valley. It includes water coming from the Delta has come down. Colorado River use, but in urban Southern California has come down. And one of the remaining, you know, we talked about supply diversification, 15% now of urban Southern California water use is from long-term water trades, from agriculture. And there are a lot of low-income folks in Southern California that are that benefit also from these trades. So when we think about equity, we have to think about it, you know, in the whole package, and we have to think about trading in a smart way. So there need to be protections, but we shouldn't just have a mentality of circle the wagons around every drop of water in its source region.
Thank you. This was an amazing panel. Really appreciate your participating and all the great thoughts and responses. Jerry, should I turn it back over to you?
Sure. So thank you, Eric, and thank you to the panelists.